I won't stop. I can't be stopped by someone who's already dead. Everything is meaningless without your own life. Don't you think so too? Those two quotes are from the last Niko, which I'll be referring to as Niko for the rest of this. For purposes that will become clear later, I'll just call him Niko. But Niko is one of, if not the most iconic villain in the Kengan series. One could say he's the most important villain, and I use the word villain wisely here because unlike some other characters that you can call antagonists, Niko goes beyond just being an antagonist and is just straight up evil. However, this video will be talking a lot more about him, his potential goals, and also what is his inevitable downfall and how that specifically will happen. But before we get into that, don't forget to like and sub. I make these types of videos, usually analysis and theory videos, weekly. So if you like that type of stuff, don't forget to like and sub, and let's carry on with the video. To understand who Niko really is as a character, understanding Mukaku is sort of compulsory, but I'll give the Cliff Notes version of Mukaku. He was basically an evil type of father who managed to basically put up a good front, or at least seem genuine, until he could no longer benefit from his student kids. We see the way Mukaku actually used the kids to basically form a mini army so that he could take down Shen. And when that doesn't work out, he basically throws them away and does not look back. In the Gakigahara forest, it seems to be implied that the last Niko, when he was young back then, seemed to have found out Mukaku's true nature somehow. Whether he ran into the cave that we saw when we went to save Ryuki that was filled with the bones and corpses of all those adopted kids that Mukaku brought in to learn the Niko style. Maybe he saw that, or some other means that seemed to be the point in which Niko probably changed to who he is today. And we see this in the Kakigahara forest, where he lets one of his brothers die. And Mukaku points out that, oh great, you ran an experiment with him. And Niko doesn't deny it. In fact, he's like, oh great, I learned something new here. This interaction shows just how evil he is and the type of evil he actually is. The way to describe it is sort of like, I'm going to name an iconic villain, right? Think of Thanos from the MCU. Niko sort of represents that type of evil, a sort of human sacrifice type of evil. Now granted, Thanos is trying to be more quote-unquote nobler by saying he's going to save the universe by killing people, but Niko's sort of sacrificing people as well, but to gain more power. And he's kind of got the perfect ability for this, where he's basically a high IQ fighter, essentially. He's able to pick up and learn from other people very quickly. It is his biggest asset. And it's important to also keep that in mind as we carry on with this video. But because of his talents and his basically human sacrificing, he has become incredibly evil by combining both his evil and his talent, and started using children as guinea pigs to make himself stronger. People like Kano Agito, Oma, Faye, and even Setsuna. These are just merely examples that come after he sacrificed his own brother. And so the bulk of Niko's strength comes from this process of sacrificing his own students, pushing them to the brink of death, or even to death itself, and taking that power and using it for himself. However, one has to ask the question, why do all this? What is Niko's goal, you could say? And some people might think his goal has something to do with Oma, and I think definitely does kind of look that way. Let me say that. But I think it's important to stick to whatever his goal was at like the beginning of this. And it's actually similar to Oma's master, who I will be referring to as Togita. Togita and Niko have the same goal. Essentially, it is to improve the Niko style. In Niko's case, he's trying to perfect it. He's trying to take it to the next level. This might be because he's met Shen, he knows how strong Shen is, and he wants to improve the Niko style as such to be able to defeat someone like Shen Wulong or maybe even Lohan himself. Niko's goal has everything points to that being Niko's goal. From his human sacrificing to his interactions with Oma as well, Niko and Togita's master have focused on improving the Niko style through different methods. Niko chooses human sacrifice, and Togita sort of does, but in a far more giving fashion, let's say. He passes on his own power rather than take that power from his students. This is going to be a very important theme or narrative point, because Togita is able to beat Niko while essentially heavily injured. Even though we're assuming at that point Niko is still doing his little human sacrificing and learning from his own students that he's basically pushing to death. And still Togita, Oma's master, even while injured Togita's master is able to defeat him even in that state, to the point where it was assumed that both Niko and Togita were dead. But Niko survives this interaction, and my earlier quote, Niko sort of mocks Togita for, even though he won the battle, Niko's like, I won the war because I survived. But that is actually the key to beating Niko. Niko's weakness has sort of been already foreshadowed in his interaction against his polar opposite, which is Togita. But let's now proceed to his actual downfall, now that we've understood his character a bit more. When it comes to people who can actually defeat Niko, we have to keep in mind, or I'm going to say something that's going to be a very controversial at this point. I do not think anyone that Niko has used to get to his level of power will be able to defeat him. The reason why is very simple. Everyone that Niko has used wants revenge, and typically, at least in the Kengan verse, revenge plots rarely pay off in the way you think they will. Like, for example, in Kengan Ashura, Oma wanted revenge against, of course, Niko, the last Niko. But by the end of Ashura, he doesn't come close to that goal at all. You had Kuroki, who in his fight against Setsuna wanted revenge for his friend, but in the end does not kill Setsuna. Setsuna, who sort of set himself as the replacement of Niko, when Oma fights him, it's to liberate him, not to get some quote-unquote revenge. My point of bringing up these moments is to show that revenge plots rarely pay off. The only time you could say a revenge plot sort of paid off is in the current war between the Westwood faction and the Wu clan and Kure clan. That's really it, with the whole Edward situation. That's the only thing that comes to my head. Other than that, yeah, revenge plots don't really go in the direction you think they're going to go. But another reason is that Niko will learn from his students and improve way beyond them. And that means that Niko has sort of pulled ahead of them, literally in terms of using them as power. He has their powers, you could say, but also in a narrative sense. They are more than likely just behind Niko. And so this does knock out people like Kano Agito, Setsuna, and maybe, or I would say probably even Oma, when it comes to defeating Niko and being the reason for his downfall. Because again, think of it this way. Even Niko himself wanted revenge on Mukaku at some point, or wanted to face him. That will never happen because of Shen Wulong. He just killed him, right? But this also goes to show, again, a difference between Mukaku and Niko, which will segue into his downfall. The reason Mukaku goes down, his downfall, boils down to him stopping to be in his evil ways to use other people. It is when he gives up on Ryuki that his death becomes essentially sealed, as we see that Shen actually knew that he could kill Mukaku because Ryuki didn't keep Ryuki hostage. But for Niko hasn't stopped. So Niko will have to be stopped. And there are only two options when it comes to this. The first one, I did cover it in my top 5 most anticipated fights in the series. The first candidate for this is, of course, the wild tiger Wakatsuki. Wakatsuki is incredibly naturally talented, but he is also incredibly dangerous for his self-improvement. Unlike Niko, who of course uses others, Wakatsuki can grow by leaps and bounds on his own. Think about when he lost to Kano Akito. That loss led to the Blast Core, which is one of the strongest attacks in the series. And when he lost to Oma, he managed to get a very good methodology for shutting down the Niko style, even though he wasn't perfect at execution. And if you also consider the fact that Wakatsuki has fought almost all of Niko's students and lost to almost all of them, Niko versus Wakatsuki being the culmination of Wakatsuki's build up in strength is perfect in my opinion. But even though I wouldn't mind Wakatsuki being the reason Niko falls, I think the key to defeating Niko is actually the Niko style itself, which goes back to the second quote I had in the introduction, where Niko mocked Togita for being dead and said Togita could never defeat him because he's dead, or could never stop him because he's dead. However, Togita does sort of exist within the current Niko style that is in Oma's hands, that will be transferred over to Koga. And Koga is the next big candidate. If Koga becomes a Niko style practitioner, if he inherits everything as Oma has said, then he is basically the antithesis of everything Niko stands for as a Niko style user. Whereas Niko used his students to become more powerful, you have the Niko style developed by Togita that is built on sharing that power and passing it on. And so, in that symbolic sense, Koga is the proper person to stop Niko and to show Niko that his Niko style basically will never reach the heights that it could have because of the way he went about gaining power. But that's it. That's the theory. And a small breakdown of Niko's character and how that factors in to his own downfall. The reason Niko will ultimately lose is because his Niko style comes from using other people to become stronger. That's the reason. He has tied himself to the progression of others, and thus won't be able to move far on his own. That will be the reason Niko ultimately loses. But yeah, that's the video. Don't forget to like, sub, all that fun stuff. And until next time, take it easy.